Hello, it's Dr. Grant again, and in this video we will discuss how to compose 2-to-1 counterpoint, or in other words, we will learn how tonal voice leading works when one voice is moving twice as fast as the other. This video will be broken into 3 parts. First, we'll learn what's new in 2-to-1 counterpoint compared to what we've already learned in 1-to-1 counterpoint. Then we'll see how Mozart tried to edit and improve a 2-to-1 counterpoint melody composed by Fuchs, and get a better sense of the types of decisions that are involved in making this exercise work as well as possible. Then I'll wrap up by going over the work that you can do on your own to improve your mastery over this kind of exercise. If you're going to compose 2 new notes in your counterpoint for every note of the given melody, some of the counterpoint notes are going to coincide with the given melody, and others are going to happen in between the attacks of the notes of the given melody. When the voices coincide, they create what's called a grouping accent, making those notes more prominent in the listener's attention. This accented area of the pattern we call the downbeat, and the unaccented part of the pattern we call the upbeat. Back in 1-to-1 counterpoint, when both voices changed notes at the same rate, we had an evenly spaced pulse of beats, and theorists would call this a pulse rather than a meter. Now that there are 2 layers of pulses that interact to create a regular pattern of accented and unaccented beats, we can say that the music has a duple meter. The listener can predict that every other beat will have an accent. This is expressed with a time signature of 2-2, or cut time, although time signatures are often optional in counterpoint exercises. For 2-to-1 counterpoint, the rules for composing tones on the downbeat are completely different than composing tones on the upbeat, because of the inherent difference in accent between those 2 metrical positions. I'd like to say that there is a common misconception that counterpoint is only about canons and fugues and stuff like that, but actually counterpoint pedagogy is often about connecting many different areas of music theory, including in this case, the way that meter and rhythm interact with melody and voice leading. Consonant harmonic intervals may be formed on either the downbeat or the upbeat. So any of the perfect or imperfect intervals that we used in our 1-to-1 exercises may be used on either beat. Here we see a 10th on the first downbeat, octave on the upbeat, and a 3rd on the second downbeat. The options for forming consonances above a given note tend to be a little bit spread out, as we see here, the melody needing to leap in order to form consonances. Leaping twice in the same direction is much more common and acceptable in 2-to-1 counterpoint than in 1-to-1 counterpoint. A useful thing to remember is that the only adjacent consonances that can be formed above a given note are the 5th and 6th. So if our counterpoint melody can stay roughly that distance away from the given melody, then we can include consonant intervals using stepwise motion instead of needing to leap. In 1-to-1 counterpoint, we were not allowed to use dissonant intervals, even though they create the strongest sense of voice leading independence. In 2-to-1 counterpoint, we are allowed to use dissonant intervals under 2 conditions. The first is that they must occur on the upbeat, or the weak, unaccented part of the measure. The second is that the dissonance must be approached and left by step in the same direction, so that means either 2 steps up in a row or 2 steps downward in a row. When a dissonance is formed in this way, we call it a dissonant passing tone, and this is the most important new concept in 2-to-1 counterpoint. Here we see a dissonant 7th functioning as a passing tone, but any diatonic dissonance can be used for a passing tone, such as a 2nd, a 4th, or a 9th. At the end of the video, I'm going to ask you to prepare analytic diagrams, just like we did as homework to the previous video. I'd like you to diagram the dissonant passing tones in your exercises in the following way. First, give the passing tone a filled-in note head, kind of like a quarter note, but without the stem. We're not using this notation to try to say anything about the tone's duration or rhythm. Instead, we want to draw attention to the conditional status of the passing tone. Literally, it came about by passing between two consonances, and we want to show that hierarchy visually. Second, connect the downbeat consonances with a slur that covers over the dissonant passing tone. You can think of that slur exactly like a slur from our one-to-one analytic diagrams, which we use to show a consonant leap. In this case, the leap is of a third from C to A. Dissonant passing tones always end up filling in a space of a third in 2-to-1 counterpoint. Technically, all of the motion from a downbeat to the next upbeat is oblique motion, since the whole note in the given melody does not move, while the counterpoint half notes do. Here we see a voice leading error of parallel fifths formed between the upbeat moving to the next downbeat. These parallel fifths are just as bad as if they had occurred in 1-to-1 counterpoint. Parallel fifths, or octaves, that are formed on consecutive downbeats also come out sounding clunky and not very independent. The fact that the fifths are accented by their metric position forces those sounds forward in the listener's attention, and the fact that a counterpoint note stands on the upbeat between the two fifths is not enough to mitigate the sound of the parallel motion between the downbeats. So, avoid parallel perfect intervals on consecutive downbeats. Fifths or octaves on consecutive upbeats, though, are completely fine. Their weak positioning pulls them out of focus from the listener's attention. Here's an example from a piece of music by J.S. Bach. Notice that the 16th notes of the treble clef are moving twice as fast as the 8th notes of the bass clef. Although this doesn't look anything like a species counterpoint exercise, the two voices are moving in a 2-to-1 rhythmic proportion, and so the voice leading principles we're learning about would apply to a situation like this. Bach chooses to place the fifths on the weak part of each pair of notes, rather than placing them together, which would accent them and lead to the sound of parallel fifths. Instead, Bach accents the thirds, and this sounds much smoother. The problem of consecutive downbeats is only a problem with parallel motion specifically. Direct motion from downbeat to downbeat can be easily smoothed over, depending on the note we choose to compose on the upbeat. If this were a first species exercise, the sixth moving to a fifth would form direct motion to a perfect interval, which would be something to avoid. How can we fix this? By composing a leap down to G on the upbeat, we are able to approach the sound of a fifth through contrary motion from upbeat to downbeat. And this is enough to counteract the sense of direct motion between the two downbeats. In our 2-to-1 exercises, we want to avoid outlining a dissonant interval between adjacent downbeats. Here our counterpoint melody has a B on the first downbeat and F on the following one, which outlines a dissonant diminished fifth. You can imagine that if the upbeat note were omitted, the counterpoint would have leapt by a dissonant interval. An important exception to this would be large leaps that are recovered by step in the opposite direction. So, for instance, if we had leapt to a G on the upbeat instead of E, then the recovery down to F would have smoothed over that dissonant outline. We aren't going to use any tone repetitions in our 2-to-1 exercises. If we repeated a tone from the downbeat to the upbeat, that would be equivalent to only composing one note against our given note, which is a voice-leading situation that we've already covered in our 1-to-1 exercises. Also, if we repeated tones from the upbeat to the downbeat, that would be equivalent to what is known as a consonant suspension, which we will cover in a future exercise. For now, in 2-to-1, we will not repeat tones at all. So far, we've focused on all the things you shouldn't do. Now let's talk about things you can do in 2-to-1 exercises that will improve your melodic lines, starting with the usefulness of upbeat leaps. Here we see a very fluent counterpoint melody moving in stepwise motion. C, B, A, B, C. This is a perfectly acceptable counterpoint. In fact, it's a very good one. I especially like the way it moves in overall contrary motion to the given melody, and the two dissonant passing tones on the upbeats. Since we're allowed to use dissonances, we might as well make full use of them. But this melody could still be improved. One possible criticism is that the second half of the melody reuses tones that we've already heard, and so the second passing tone appears somewhat unmotivated. We want our melodies to have a strong sense of purposeful, goal-directed motion, and melodies that cover the same ground back and forth stepwise rarely achieve that. If we replace the first passing tone B with a leap down to G, then we increase the range and motivate the second half of the melody. Now in the first measure we have a leap downwards between the most stable tones of the scale, in solfege syllables do and sol. That leap opens up a gap, and the stepwise ascent G, A, B, C not only recovers the leap, but also fills in that gap in a satisfying and purposeful way. When our counterpoint melody strays too far away from the given melody, and the spacing between the voices starts to become a problem, we can use an octave leap to quickly and convincingly change registers. Remember that especially large leaps, such as an octave, will create a strong need for recovery in the opposite direction, and that's especially true if there are tones within that octave leap that have not yet been heard. Then we will expect those gaps to be filled in if possible. In one-to-one counterpoint, unisons were too strong of a perfect consonance, and so they were only permitted at the beginning or the ending of an exercise. In two-to-one counterpoint, perfect unisons are allowed as long as they occur on the upbeat, as we see here. The perfect consonances will bog down the forward flow of our compositions, and so they always need some sort of mitigating factor to keep the momentum going. In the case of octaves and fifths, the mitigating factor was how they were approached in either contrary or oblique motion. Whereas here, we see that the weak metrical positioning of the upbeat can also act as a mitigating factor. There are two ways to begin the first measure of a 2-to-1 exercise. You can either begin normally on the first downbeat, or you can choose to begin with a half-note rest and allow the melody to begin on the upbeat. Which option is best will depend on your chosen starting tone and the initial shape of the given melody. There are two different ways to end a 2-to-1 counterpoint exercise. The first is a traditional half-note cadence in the penultimate measure, a fifth between scale degrees 2 and 6 on the downbeat, followed by a harmonic sixth as scale degree 6 moves to scale degree 7, and from there to octave scale degree 1s. It is also acceptable to end with a whole note in the penultimate measure and use the same cadence that we learned in our 1-to-1 exercises. When composing a melody below the cantus firmus, you will either need to leap from scale degree 5 to the leading tone in the penultimate measure, or use the whole note cadence from our 1-to-1 exercises. Here's the 2-to-1 counterpoint composed by Johann Joseph Fuchs, written over his well-known Dorian cantus firmus. He uses this as an example of how to compose a good 2-to-1 counterpoint melody in his textbook Gradus ad Parnassum. I've always secretly felt that this was the least successful example in Fuchs's textbook. Although it doesn't break any of Fuchs's own rules about 2-to-1 counterpoint, it has at least 3 weaknesses. First, the counterpoint melody has a limited range of about a fourth from A to D, which is outlined within the very first measure. Because we don't move outside that narrow range, the melody has also no clear high point or sense of goal-directed motion from one structural tone to another. The only notes of the melody that step outside of this limited range are this G and this E, but these do not sound like melodic points of arrival, partly because they are not stable scale degrees, like scale degrees 1, 3, 5, or 6, that are consonant with the global tonic. The restricted range wouldn't be so bad if Fuchs managed to move through that span with convincing goal-directed motion, but that's not what happens. The outer edges of the span are announced right in the first measure. It would be like if the starting block and the finish line of a race were just right next to each other. The melody just noodles around within that span of a fourth. By the time the melody does end on D, we've already heard that note 5 previous times, and the raised leading tone is the only thing that convinces us that we really are at the end of this time and that the melody won't continue noodling. Lastly, the counterpoint melody has lots of motivic repetition. Motives are melodic segments that are repeated and that chop up the counterpoint into recognizable chunks. Now, this is fine in normal music, but in a counterpoint exercise, they will only end up reminding the listener that, hey, I think I've heard this before, which is not good when the melody is already repetitive. Now that I've sufficiently prejudiced you against this melody, let's take a listen. Along came Mozart, about 60 years later, who was using Fuchs's textbook to teach his student Thomas Atwood. When it came time to teach 2-to-1 counterpoint, Mozart slightly rewrote Fuchs's counterpoint melody, and the edits that he made are quite revealing. Mozart extends the melody's range by adding a new high point and a new low point. The wider range makes it much easier to create an overall feeling of a goal-directed shape upwards and downwards. These adjustments also allow Mozart to break up the motivic repetitions that happened in Fuchs's counterpoint. But all of that improvement comes at a small price. In order to create the high point F, Mozart needed to outline a dissonant diminished fifth between consecutive downbeats. He avoided the tritone between F and B earlier by adjusting the B to a B flat. This is a common use of the B-flat accidental in the Dorian mode. But he isn't able to do that in the later measure because he wants the next note to be an E, and if he had a B-flat on the downbeat, it would form a leap of an augmented fourth. Mozart picks his poison and decides that this minor drawback is worth the improvement to the overall shape of the counterpoint melody. Maybe Fuchs considered something like this, but preferred to avoid the dissonant outline. Then, around 180 years after Mozart, Felix Salzer and Karl Schachter published a book on counterpoint that offers yet another way to compose a melody against the same cantus firmus. First off, they give the exercise a key signature of D minor, no more fussing around over modal theory. They also decide to begin with a half-note rest, which I think is a very clever way to avoid the problem of a redundant repetition of tones. They then follow Mozart's example up until here, when they ascend way higher to a high point on A, before an octave leap returns us to a normal register for the cadence. This version has no problem at all establishing a clear high point, or a sense of goal-directed motion towards it and away from it. Notice also that Salzer and Schachter's high point is offset from the high point of the cantus firmus. All three of these counterpoints are good. They just represent different styles of counterpoint. Fuchs doesn't mind having a boring melody overall, as long as the note-to-note connections are all easy, singable, and correct. On the other hand, Sulzer and Schachter are more concerned about the macroscopic features of the entire melody, even if it ends up being a little bit less easy to sing note to note. So for instance, the high unconnected passage here strikes me as something that Fuchs wouldn't have gone for. And Mozart's example is somewhere in between those two styles. Here are two Cantus Firmi by Johann Georg Albrechtsberger, one in F major and one in D minor. Compose counterpoint melodies in a 2-to-1 rhythmic proportion above and below each of these given melodies, or you can use the Cantus Firmi from the previous video. Feel free to transpose them into different registers or even into different keys if that makes things easier. This will also be a good opportunity for audiation exercises. If you can, try composing your counterpoint melodies without the assistance of an instrument, and practice audiating them in silence as you work. Then, use an instrument to double-check that you're hearing things correctly. The last step is to prepare an analytic diagram of your counterpoint melodies. Here's an example of what one may look like for a 2-to-1 exercise. You only need to diagram the dissonant passing tones of the counterpoint melody, which I showed how to do earlier on in the video, and then label all the harmonic intervals. That's all I have for this video. Stay tuned for the next one, where we will be discussing 3-to-1 counterpoint and triple meter.